people that people really want to see what they can play in best of ones right now for mono red. I know I do a lot of best of three matchups. I've been trying to do some more best of one matchups as well for YouTube and on stream. And one big thing I'm seeing in the comments is people want to see how can you play best of one right now in historic. Big reason why people like playing best of one is matches are a lot quicker. You don't have to worry about sideboarding, and you don't have to waste wild cards on your sideboard. All very, very valid reasons. And today I'm going to show you two of the decks I used in best of one to reach Mythic this past month for August 2020. So let's kind of go through. Quick overview. We're going to go over the two types of decks. I'm going to give you advice on how to play each deck. We're going to run through the matchups, and then we're going to hit a conclusion. So first things first, there's two types of mono red decks. You have your burn deck, and then you got your aggro deck. Each has their own advantages, so let's go over those. Burn. Burn is a lot less interactive. The idea here is you're using your bolts just to go straight to the face of your opponent. And what I mean by a bolt is I mean any instant or sorcery spell that you have that can deal damage to any target, or in this case, Grimlava Mantra counts. So the idea here is that you have your bolts that deal 2 or 3 damage at a time just going straight at your opponent. The idea is you kind of leave your creatures back to either the first couple turns you want to attack with them, but later on in the game you kind of want to leave them back for blockers and allow for your bolts to keep getting through upstairs. One of the really big benefits of this deck is you can get some really, really quick starts and quick wins. You can have turn 2 9 damage pretty consistently. You can go turn 1 Soulscar Mage into turn 2 Wizard's Lightning, skewer the critics at your opponent, and then attack for 3, and your opponent's already down to 11. In most cases, if your opponent's playing a shock land, they could be under 10 on their second turn. That's insanely fast. And there's definitely more combos like that with the deck as well. The other really cool thing about this is Thermo Alchemist was printed in Jumpstart. Why is that helpful? Well, Thermo Alchemist has the ability that says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you may untap it. Well, Thermo Alchemist, you can tap to deal 1 to your opponent. So let's say we have this scenario turn 3. We've done what I said above with your Soulscar Mage or whatever. Maybe you play Soulscar Mage turn 1, turn 2 you go Thermo. Turn 3 you have 3 lands out, and let's say you have triple skew the critics in hand. At this point, we're going to assume your opponent's at, we'll say 19 due to Soulscar Mage getting in for 1. And this turn, we will be able to tap Thermo Alchemist 4 times and cast 3 Skew the Critics for 13 damage. Plus, you have your Soulscar Mage that can get in for 4. At this point, your opponent's already down to 4. And at most of the time, they'll either have 1 creature out or no creatures out if you're on the play. So that is absolutely huge. You can get some super, super quick wins. Thermal Alchemist is just an absolute monster. Downside, though, is if your Alchemist dies, you can kind of run out of gas, which is kind of one of the cons of the deck is you need light up the stage to be able to hit some of your threats. But if you don't find that light up the stage, sometimes you can be relying on the top of your deck, which can be pretty tough to do against some of the more aggressive decks in the current meta for best of one. Next, we're going to take a look at aggro. Aggro is definitely more interactive, a lot more creature-based attacks. And in aggro, the other thing too is we have a lot bigger creatures. We have Goblin Chain Whirler, Rampaging Phrastodon, Hazoret, right? Really big creatures that can deal big amounts of damage and have really, really good effects on them. And we really want to keep those creatures on the field, and we want to use those creatures to deal damage to our opponent. So what do we do in that situation? Well, we utilize our burn spells that we have to clear the board. So we use our lightning strikes and our wizard's lightnings to take care of creature cards our opponents might have to kind of open the way for these creatures to attack and get through. Also, the bigger creatures really help with some of the decks that go maybe in the more mid-range long game game plan. Azorius Control, it feels really good to drop a Hazoret after your opponent uses a Wrath of God, turn 4. At that point, if they have another Wrath of God, they're not killing your Hazoret. And most of the time, when they cast it to Fairy, they're going to untap their 2 lands and draw a card. So Hazoret feels kind of good in that situation as well. The one downside, however, too, is you can run out of gas. I've tried, Experimental Frenzy in this list, but the one downside with it is I always find myself playing it too late, or I'm just not having it in my initial hand, and even when I do have it in my initial hand, it just feels too slow. Um, so I definitely think Experimental Frenzy is better for best of 3 matchups, and it's better. You can play in the standard best of 1 mono red, but in historic, I just don't feel like it belongs in the best of 1 matchups. So now let's kind of go over each deck list. So for the burn deck list, what we have here is we have 4 Get 2 Lava Runners, 2 Grim Lava Mancers, and 4 Soulscar Mages to round out your 1-drop creature spells. What's really important about all these 1-drops is they're wizards. They activate that Wizard's Lightning we have a 4 of in the back. Plus, they all are able to act as defenders, and Soulscar Mage's ability of the -1/-1 counters can be extremely useful in some matchups. So that's pretty useful. I didn't choose to use Risk Factor in this deck. It just feels a little too slow. This deck is trying to win turn 3, 4, or 5. Risk Factor, majority of the time, just feels a little too slow for being a 3-drop cost. The other good news is we have Shock, Lightning Strike, Skew the Critics, and Wizard's Lightning as your bolts. All those usually just go straight upstairs. You got 4 Thermo Alchemists, 4 Vishino Pyromancers to deal straight 2 damage to your opponent and leave back a blocker. Bone Crusher Giant for 2. Sometimes it's good if it does go to a later game just to have the body of a big creature. Bone Crusher Giant does that pretty well. And then obviously 4 Ramanap Ruins and 16 Mountains. The 20 lands has felt very, very good in best of 1 due to the algorithm for hand smoothing. And Ramanap Ruins also, if you get a late game and you're living off the top of your deck, it's good to have out as it can just deal 2 straight to your opponent. Countless games where I've won with Ruins with no cards in hand, just because I know we're going to beat our opponent out for 2 points of damage. So next, let's go and look at the aggro list. Aggro list is the same drops in the 1-drop slot. All 3 of those creatures are insanely important. However, the deck changes in the back half, in the back end. So in here we have 1 Abrade. The reason I play the 1 Abrade instead of 4 Lightning Strikes is Jund's Sacrifice pops up every now and then, and I like having the Abrade to deal with the Witch's Oven. Also, in some of the aggro matches now, I'm starting to see a lot more Stone Coil Serpents, and Abrade does a really, really good job of dealing with that creature as well. Also, for Azorius Auroras, it feels really good to Abrade a big Ornithopter on like turn 3 or 4, which is pretty cool. Lightning Strike here and your Wizard's Lightning are more utilized as removal spells, as well as your Shock for some of your opponent's creatures. The idea is they clear the way for those back half creatures. Bone Crusher Giant here is phenomenal. Being able to use it on turn 2 to use a stomp and kill a creature, and then play turn 3 and have a 4/3 body out is awesome. Rampaging for Acidon is really, really good against some of the life gain decks, and it was super good against Field of the Dead, but that is banned now. But I still think it's a great card because it has Menace, which still allows you to get in for 3 most turns. Goblin Chain Whirler is awesome against the creature tribal decks. It is an all-star against Elves and is an all-star against Goblins, but we'll get to that later. And it does pretty well against the Spirits deck that I've seen recently around. Not super popular, not on this list, but Goblin Chain Whirler is an all-star against that. See it more in best of 3s. Hazret, I mean, I don't really know what you have to say here. A 5/4 indestructible with haste is just insanely good. And the fact that if you get a bad draw off the top of your deck, you can just mill 2. If you get an extra land you don't need, pay 3, deal 2 upstairs, and continue to swing in with everything you have. So I really like this deck as well. I play a list pretty similar to this in my best of 3, but that's for another video. So let's kind of run through some of the matchups here. The first matchup we have here is Elves. So let's run through it on the burn side. With burn, you want to be sending all your bolts at your opponent. Do not worry about the lords. Don't worry about the lords in the beginning or their mana dorks. Keep sending everything upstairs. The goal is to outrace your opponent here. It takes them at least 3 or 4 turns to set up, and by those 3 or 4 turns, you can already have your opponent down to around 6 or 7, and they're going to have to start blocking some of your lower cost creatures. Um, One thing too to worry about is the lords. The lords can get out of hand. Um, I personally don't really deal with the lords too much with this stock list. Um, that's more of the aggro side of the matchup that you want to deal with the lords. The only downside with burn is you do get beat if they are playing collected company. Company just comes out and it just takes it can take a steel leaf champion off the top. It can take out a lord. It takes a lot of things that can just kind of get around your board state and in for damage, causing you to play a little bit more defense come turn 4, turn 5, where you really want to be a lot more aggressive on those turns. So I consider elves for burn a 50-50. Now, when we look at the aggro matchup, um, aggro uses bolts as removal against the mana dorks and the lords. So the picture we have here, Elvish Archdruid, if you have, let's say, 2 creatures out turn 2, and turn 3, your opponent goes, they play this, and you are sitting with an Abrade or a Goblin Chain Whirler in hand, you use the Abrade or the Lightning Strike every time to deal with the Elvish Archdruid. You do not go straight in to the Phrastodon or the Chain Whirler. It is important to get rid of lords every time you can, because if you let too many lords get out on the battlefield, they get out of range of your removal spells. So it's super, super important to get rid of the lords. Um, Also, the mana dorks, most of the time they utilize them to block once they see we're playing mono red, which isn't a problem. But in the later turns, you want to get rid of the mana dorks. Crater Hoof Behemoth is a real risk in this deck sometimes, so you gotta be careful with that. Chain Whirler is amazing in this matchup. It is really cool when they don't have a Lord out, or even a turn after they play a Lord, when they have all their 1/1s or their 2/1s out, just to play a Chain Wheeler, wipe the board, and just swing in with your crew and deal 10 plus points of damage, usually on turn 3 or 4, which is just awesome. And then in the late turns, you still want to hold up removal. um, my big thing is if they got 4 untapped, don't attack. Most of the times they are going to play collected company, and you want to be able to have removal for that collected company the next turn, or if it's in the attacking step, you can. Most of the time, I see opponents sometimes play it in the blocking step. So it's you gotta be careful. If your opponent plays collected company in the attack step, and they get their cards out before they declare blocks, go ahead, get rid of it. If they don't, hold back everything and then utilize your removal next turn. I consider this a great matchup for aggro. It's just super fast, and you're able to just deal a ton of damage through, and they really just don't get a chance to set up, which is awesome. So now we'll move on to our next deck. The next one is Mono Black Aggro. This deck is very difficult for both in best of 1 matchups. I even struggle with this deck right now in best of 3s. I definitely say this right now is becoming the bane of a good amount of my mono red decks I've been playing in Mythic. And Phyrexian Obliterator is just so tough to get around. So in both cases here, you got to be careful about the lifelink creatures they have. They have a few, and usually, if you have your bolts, you got to take them out. Lifelink just shuts down our strategy completely. Unless you have a rampaging Phrastodon out, it is insanely hard to beat those. Also, their Death Touchers can just get rid of some of our big creatures like Bone Crusher Giant, Goblin Chain Whirler. So it's super important to deal with those too. Um, when Phyrexian Obliterator is out, you basically are on a 4-turn clock. 4-turn clock, because you almost never want to deal damage to it. It is our lands are important and our creatures are super important. And if you were to kill Phyrexian Obliterator, you basically die. It is insanely hard to beat. The only out I've seen to beat Phyrexian Obliterator is Soulscar Mage dealing damage to it, because Soulscar Mage doesn't deal damage; it puts counters on. So in this case, you're putting -1/-1 counters on. So that is the one out you kind of have, the one saving grace. But a 5/5 is just insanely hard to deal with, and it's a very, very small chance of having that situation happen usually. Um, Also, do not keep mana heavy hands. You do not want to be keeping a 4 or 5 land hand with a quick start. They almost always have discard. They will Thoughtseize you, and they are just going to get rid of your hand on those early turns. I'm blanking on the name of the 2-drop from Ikoria, um, that acts as kind of a Thoughtseize, but you lose 1 life instead. Um, can't remember the name, but they always carry basically that suite. They usually have, I'd say, 5 or 6 discard cards in their deck that they're always just going after your hand with. It is possible to beat mono black aggro, but it's definitely a little bit more difficult to do so. Um, so yeah, we'll consider that one a difficult matchup. Hopefully, we can get some matches against it uploaded YouTube, win or lose, just to kind of highlight that as well. The next deck, Goblins. I've seen a lot of people complain about Goblins online, on Reddit and on YouTube, and I honestly have never had a problem with Goblins. I'm wondering if it's just because people haven't figured out the matchup, maybe. But even in best of threes, I think Goblins is almost always a free win, and then in best of ones, it's definitely a lot more favored, I'll say. Burn, you just continue to send all the bolts up at your opponent, except when they have a Skirk Protector out, or a Lord out. You basically want to just get rid of those. Skirk allows them to just ramp into Muxus turn 3, which can just be absolutely disgusting sometimes. So always just get rid of Skirk. Turn on those early turns, continue to apply pressure. Sometimes your opponent's going to realize you're playing a burn deck, and they're just going to keep chump blocking with those, which is going to cause them to have a very weak board state come the later turns for sure. I consider burn Goblins to be just a great matchup. Goblins is just a little too slow for burn, and they don't have life gain. Um, and The Alchemist combo is just too strong for burn, for Goblins. For aggro, kind of similar. Always use the bolts and removal against the lords and the Skirk Prospector. The downside is we don't have Skewer the Critics, um, which does act as sometimes a bit more removal in situations. But in this case, it's not. So we need to be careful with our removal here. Kind of go after their bigger creatures, such as the lords and the Snoop, and apply early pressure and allow the big creatures to get on the board. Goblin Chain Whirler is 100% the best card in this matchup, as long as they don't have a Lord out. When they have a Lord out, you always get rid of the Lord. But when they don't, all their creatures are basically 1/1s. Going Chain Whirler on turn 3 or 4 usually just causes your opponent to end the game. They basically just forfeit. However, I will say too, the nice thing is, another thing is if you can't get Chain Whirler, your deck has Pharasodon. If you're able to get a Pharasodon out and you've been applying enough early pressure, by the time they play Muxus, right? Let's say they hit four cards off Muxus. That's going to be 5 damage they take right off the bat at their head, right? And you usually will have a blocker for the Muxus, and by that time, your opponent just basically doesn't have a way to stop it. Um, at that point in the game, you usually have just dealt enough damage. I do consider this a 50-50 matchup. There are times where you're just not able to get a board state in time, and due to having to use a lot of removal on the goblins, you can kind of, like I said, run out of gas pretty in the mid game, whereas goblins kind of has a little bit more ways to get out mid game than this deck does, other than just big creatures. The second they get a Muxus down and you don't have a Pharasodon out, that matchup just gets near impossible. But I will say it's probably 50-50 in best of one. In best of threes, however, I think Goblins is an automatic win every time post sideboard. Next matchup, Soul Sisters. This is definitely a very, very difficult matchup for the deck. I've had a decent amount of success with it. And for both decks, you have to kill the Soul Warden early. The Soul Warden is just super, super tough. If you let them hit 25 or 27 life total for their totals, you just lose. And some decks I've seen play Johnny's Pride Made, some are playing Angels. You have to get rid of their cards that rely on life gain. So not the cards that have lifelink, but if they have a card that says when it has 25 or more life, it gets +2/+2, or Johnny's Pride Made where it's saying every time you gain life, put a counter on it. You got to get rid of those cards at the start. The start when they come out, because a Johnny's Pride Made, right, come turn 3 can be a 5/5 in the right conditions if you don't get rid of it. So it's really, really important to deal with that. The other thing is, don't be afraid for Soulscar Mage to use those -1 counters. If you do go, I'd say mid game, late game, and they do have a bigger angel out, and you have them, let's say, I don't know, 5 to 7, and you're relying off the top of your deck, and you know you can kill an angel, and that's all they got out, and their hand's empty too. Because their decks can run out of gas too. That is extremely important to note. Utilize those -1 counters in situations. It does make a huge, huge difference, and it definitely does catch your opponent off guard. The other thing too is I've seen kind of a Selesnya version of the list that will play Collected Company, and sometimes they have a Soul Warden out, and they'll just be able to get 2 Angels and a Johnny's Pride Made, or a Soul Warden and a Johnny's Pride Made out, and you can just lose the game on the spot there. So be careful utilizing your spells if you see green. Maybe hold them back just to be able to deal damage to the Soul Wardens and whatever creature comes out of the Collected Company. Also, Pharasodon isn't all-star in this matchup, but it is a little bit slow as they do have Soul Wardens that come out turn 1, whereas Pharasodon's turn 3. I do consider this a difficult matchup, but it's definitely winnable. I have a video or two up on YouTube against Soul Sisters that you can go and rewatch. It is definitely winnable, both the Angel version, the Collected Company version, just the standard Soul Sisters list. It is winnable, but you have to play very, very smart and methodically as well. So let's look at the next matchup. Personally, I'm not a fan of this matchup at all, but I've actually had a decent amount of success with it. This is the matchup I actually had to beat to get into Mythic, but it was in best of 3, not best of 1. Best of 1, I think Burn is awesome. You just send your bolts almost every time at your opponent, except when they have a lifelinker out. There's a blue and white enchantment Aurora and Theros. If they get a Core Spirit Dancer out or they have a Dante's Vanguard, utilize your bolts on those, right? Also, always kill lures for both matchups. But those 1-drops you have, start attacking with them early. Starting to get in for chips of damage, and then the Thermo combo, the Alchemist combo, is just insanely good against this deck as well. Also, Soulscar Mage's -1 counters are pretty cool here. So I think it's on YouTube. I would have to double check. But there's a match where we had Soulscar Mage out, and our opponent had a Dante's Vanguard out. And I kind of baited our opponent here just to see sometimes if they can lose 4 life, because Danto Vanguard's ability says you can pay 4 life and a Danto Vanguard becomes indestructible, right? So what happens is I will sometimes go turn 1 Soulscar Mage into turn 2 Shock on the Adanto's Vanguard, and our opponent will pay the 4 life, making it indestructible, not realizing that it's not dealing damage, it's putting -1/-1 counters on it. And because of those -1/-1 counters, Adanto Vanguard's toughness goes to 0, and it actually dies. And our opponent paid 4 life for it to die, while we're also able to get in for another 2 points of damage off the Soulscar Mage. That is an awesome, awesome tactic that we've had. For Burn, I consider this a great matchup. For Aggro, I consider this more of a 50-50 matchup, due to having a little bit less removal and not really utilizing our bolts to go upstairs. Most of the time, we're utilizing them to get rid of whatever creature they have that they're trying to equip their enchantments to. But the one downside is a lot of our creatures are in the upper end of the scale for mana cost, whereas they are a lot more quicker with their mana and getting out their big threats early. So it's a little bit tougher for aggro than it is for burn. Aggro, maybe it's not a 50-50 matchup. I'd probably say it's about 60-40 us, but it is still a more even matchup than it is for a burn deck, for sure. Best of 3 though, aggro is really really good against this deck. Next is Sultairo. Burn is it's a 50-50 matchup. Usually for burn to win, you have to outrace Uro. You have to just get the most aggressive hand you can get, and it takes a bit of luck. But the second they are able to escape with Uro, the match is just over. Electro combo dealing those 13 points of damage, like I said in the scenario from earlier, is insanely important against this matchup. Being aggressive when those one drops, always attacking, because most of the time here they're trying to play Uro, they're trying to get into a Nissa, the new Teferi. I guess we'll call it T4 Fairy, um, and just a lot more creatures. So it's super super important here to just not let Uro escape. They usually don't play any creatures except for Uro. So I've seen a Planeswalker list, which was kind of a weird list, but we played pretty well against it. The one thing that has caught me off guard is I've seen Massacre Girl, but I've only seen it out of the sideboard. I haven't seen it in the main deck. So that's probably not something to worry about in best of ones, but be aware it could come out in the best of ones. I also think a lot of those Sultai Field of the Dead decks are going to transition to Sultai Uro. So kind of be prepared for those matchups in the coming months. Aggro here, I think it's a great matchup. Oh my gosh, I have the text on the slider on. I forgot to update that one slide. Dang. But it is a great matchup. You're able to play your one drops, and you're able to play more of the burn style in the beginning, but also have bigger creatures in the end that can also deal a ton of damage, even if Uro's able to escape. So I definitely think it's a little bit better for the aggro matchup than it is for the burn matchup. Need to go back and fix that slide, but that's okay. Cruel aggro. This is actually my least favorite matchup in best of one. Best of 3, I'd probably say it's a difficult matchup. Best of 1, it's so hard. Every time I see it, I basically just hit the setting button, go click concede, and just queue up for my next match. It is just so hard to beat. Turn one Land War Elves. Turn 2, the Gruul 3. Blank on the name. It's a hexproof Gruul card. That can come in as a 4/4. And then turn 3, you can see Questing Beast, or even turn 2, you can see a Bone Crusher Giant. And this list plays Emberclave, and with Emberclave, you can basically see Emberclave out turn 4, dealing. I don't know. I think the highest I've seen an Emberclave damage deal at that point, I think I've seen it deal 12. So, and this list plays Scavenging Ooze, so it kind of gets rid of your Grim Lavamancer targets, and because you're having to block with creatures, they're getting life gain off the ooze, and they're able to hit your creatures in the bin. It's just an awful matchup for mono red. I haven't figured out how to beat this list yet. I'm working on trying to figure out ways to beat it, but it's definitely going to take some time. I wish I had better advice for this one, but I don't. It's a very very hard matchup. And the next one is Azorius and Esper Control. I kind of put these two together. The only thing you'll see more in Esper Control is you'll see a Languish, probably, or a Ritual Suit, or Sut. It's one of the two. But yeah, turn 4 Wrath effects basically. Esper Control, I've seen play Liliana as well, which is a bit interesting, but it's nothing too out of the ordinary. The trick is with both decks, be super aggressive and use your bolts to get up at your opponent. they don't really play creatures. Those early turns, they're just going to be cycling, or they're going to try and counter your spells. Luckily, both decks have those low drop curves in the beginning for matchups, so they're able just to get in super quick and early. Um, when it does come turn 4 or your turn 3, don't go dumping your hand for creature spells. Let your opponent play their wrath. It will probably kill 2. If you play it right, it will kill 2 creatures. Then your next turn, you can unload your hand. It is very unlikely, unless it's Esper control, that they have another wrath effect. This way, you're allowed to unload your hand and still basically be able to reset against a wrath. If you don't, you're basically living off the top deck to win that game, and it's not fun relying off the top of your deck to get out of that. And Experimental Frenzy here wouldn't be good because they can just counter it. So being able to hold things back after the wrath is insanely important. Also, Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, you have to deal with that card. If it's able to get out of hand, the second it activates its ultimate, you just lose. And there's no way around it. It's kind of like Jason Mind Sculptor when it comes to ultimate. You can't beat it. One card I will say to be careful of too, that's not on here, is Shark Typhoon. I've seen lists sometimes cycle it later games instead of actually cast it. So they are able to get like a 3/3 or 4/4 shark out. So that's just something to be a little bit wary of, but that's only if the game goes late. Dream Trawler, if that card hits the battlefield, it's game. It's just GG's. That card being able to have lifelink and being able to increase in power and be able to gain like 5 or 6 life back is just insanely hard to deal with. So I consider this a 50-50 matchup. If you're able to be very aggressive and get in for your points of damage, you will win. But if you're not and you don't play smart and you're not able to kind of maintain the gas, or you kind of just hit a ton of lands, you're going to lose. So I consider it a 50-50 matchup. And I believe that is it. Yeah. So that is it for our Mono Red Best of 1 deck tech. I hope you all enjoyed. Feel free to comment any questions you have on the list. I will be sure to answer them. This is my first one for Mono Red. For Best of 1s, I plan in the future on making one for my Best of 3 deck. As you can see on the screen, there is a link in the bottom to my current Best of 3 historic Mono Red list that I played to make Mythic this season. It's on MTG A Zone, Magic the Gathering Arena Zone.com. I believe it's the most recent Mono Red deck to make it to Mythic for historic. So that's pretty cool. And then, like I said before, feel free to check out the YouTube for more videos of me actually playing some of these decks in action. Best way to learn is kind of watch videos or play the deck. I have a notebook I keep just to be able to track and see what plays works well in certain decks and doesn't work in some. I was going to put Doom Foretold on this list, but I only saw it once, and I didn't want to put Is It Blitz on here because I've only seen it really in standard. Um, so we will do a standard video as well, and we will be doing a historic video as well. Probably the later part of this week and beginning part of next week, recapping the decks we play in August. Like I said, feel free to check out the YouTube for more videos. The Instagram I have created, I'm going to use that to kind of post any updates I make to the decks and also kind of showcase some of my real life cards I have. I do have some pretty valuable cards. I have a full play set of Force of Wills. I have a couple of dual lands, revised dual lands. I have Jace the Mind Sculptor. I have a bunch of cool cards I want to show off as well and kind of see what people think of them. And also just show off some of my other decks I play. I'm not just a standard and historic player. I play a ton of modern with friends and a lot of legacy with friends as well. And I'm actually about to finish my first EDH deck. Not my first, I've played EDH over the years, but my first real good EDH deck, I guess. I've played Una and Perforos in the past, and I recently have Atraxa basically coming in the mail. So I definitely want to kind of take some pictures of that, see if anyone's got advice on the list. I'm not the best EDH player in the world, but yeah. So I hope everyone enjoyed. Feel free to leave any feedback you may have. Comment on other matchups. If you leave a matchup in the comments, I'll be sure to kind of comment on it. And yeah, I'm going to